This is Glenn Fulcher with another issue of Language Testing Bites. Issue 4 of Volume 34 Language Testing is a special on Corpus Linguistics and language testing, guest edited by Sarah Cushing from Georgia State University in the United States. This is very timely given the speed with which Corpus Linguistics has matured in recent years, and the possibilities it throws up for language testing. In 2008, Taylor and Barker wrote an entry for the Encyclopedia of Language and Education entitled Using Corpora for Language Assessment. But even at that stage, it wasn't entirely clear how corpora were to be employed in test design or language testing research. I can only find a few earlier direct references to the use of corpora in language testing. In 1991, Butler wrote an article in System on using concordancing to develop close tests. And in 1996, Alderson asked the question about their potential future use. And in 2000, Hargreaves, who was then director of Cambridge Assessment, suggested that corpora could be used to identify which lexical items to test in order to assess collocational knowledge. Now, clearly things have moved on, and we're delighted to welcome Sarah Cushing to Language Testing Bites to tell us more. Sarah, welcome to Language Testing Bites, and thanks for agreeing to talk to our listeners about the use of corpus linguistics in language testing.
Thanks, Glenn. I'm really excited about the upcoming special issue of language testing on this topic, so I'm glad you reached out to me to talk about it.
Perhaps we can start off with a very basic question, just in case any of our listeners haven't come across or really engaged with corpus linguistics before. Can you briefly tell us what corpus linguistics is?
Of course, great question. I'll just start with the definition that I quote in my introduction to the special issue. Corpus linguistics is, quote, the use of computer-assisted methods to study large quantities of real language. Now, there's been some discussion in the literature about whether corpus linguistics is a subfield of linguistics or a methodology or a set of tools or some combination of these things. But the main point is that researchers in corpus linguistics analyze large computerized databases of naturally occurring language, which are called corpora, that's the plural of corpus, to answer a variety of questions about how language works. So expertise in corpus linguistics is both in putting together these corpora systematically so that they're representative of a particular language variety or a particular language use situation, for example, the language used in hospitals or the language of soap operas or whatever, and also in methods for analyzing corpora using specialized tools for the automated analysis of language.
In her paper on the speaking construct in this special issue, Romer makes it clear that in fact corpora, in inverted commas there, have been used for some time. And she actually refers to my 1996 paper in language testing, which was based on an early study using corpora of learner performances on 3 task types. But at that time, of course, we didn't use the term corpus. And the very first quick, that's keyword in context, KWIC, tools were in the early stages of development by researchers like Tim Johns at the University of Birmingham in the UK. Can you tell us what tools are now available and how they can help us to analyse language in new ways that's relevant to language testing?
Well, things have come a long way since 1996. There are actually a lot of tools that are freely available to anybody who wants to dip their toes into corpus linguistics. There are both corpora that are freely available to researchers, and then there are some other analytic tools that anyone can use. So one place to start might be to look on the website for Brigham Young University. The URL is corpus.byu.edu, and there's a list of freely available corpora in both English and other languages with links. Some of the most well-known are the British National Corpus and the Corpus of Contemporary American English, or COCA. The University of Michigan also hosts a couple of specialized academic corpora. These include MyCusp, which is the Michigan Corpus of Upper-Level Student Papers, and MyCase, which is the Michigan corpus of academic spoken English. Some of these corpora come with built-in analytic tools so that you can just go in there and explore the corpora, which is really helpful for people who are just starting out. And then there are also other tools available online that you can use with any corpus. For example, Lawrence Anthony has developed tools like AntConc and AntGram for concordancing, for looking at the complexity of texts, or looking at the level of vocabulary in texts. One of our special issue authors, Xiaofei Liu, has his own syntactic complexity analyzer for second languages and also a lexical complexity analyzer, and you can use your own texts, or you can take text from a corpus and analyze the text with these tools. So what we do with corpora, basically, we use corpus linguistics to describe how people use language in a certain context. So for example, if we're interested in academic writing, we might want to look at the frequency of relative clauses, for example. Or we might be interested in looking at the difficulty of vocabulary in math textbooks. And we can also use corpus tools to make comparisons. For example, what's the difference between spoken English and written English? Or how are academic writing and journalism similar or different? Or high and low proficiency students? So there's all kinds of things we can do with corpus tools. I'm just scratching the surface right now.
I'd like to ask just one quick follow-on question. When I was reading the special issue, I got the feeling that there was more focus on writing, and in a sense, corpus approaches to assessing writing were, how shall I put this, kind of more sophisticated. Is my intuition well-founded? And if it is, why do you think this is the case?
Well, there's kind of a simple answer for that. One thing that's important to understand is that a lot of the variables that are used in corpus analysis can only be looked at with written text. So, for example, looking at the number of words per clause or something like that, you need to have a transcript of oral language in order to measure those things. And there are a lot of decisions you have to make when you're transcribing oral language. It's very time and labor intensive, so naturally there's a lot more done with the writing, which is typically already in digital formats and more easily analyzed than oral language.
Well, thanks for that clarification. I'd like to move on to the two major uses of corpora that are suggested in these papers. Egbert's article is pretty clear in stating that language testers can use corpora of language learner production, either writing or speech, or they can use corpora drawn from real-world domains to which language testers wish to make predictions from test scores. Can we focus on corpora of learner production first? What can language testers use such corpora for, and how might it help us in our work?
There are actually several things that we can do with learner corpora, but I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll just give you two examples. The first one is for item writing. For example, if you're writing a grammar test, you can base your distractors on typical errors that you would get from a learner corpus rather than just coming up with examples from your head. So that's an important use of learner corpora. Another one is to understand really how language is used at different levels of proficiency. This can really be helpful for rating scale development and validation, and also for the development of automated scoring systems. So learner corpora have become really indispensable tools for test developers.
Can we now turn to the corpora of real-world domains? Egbert refers to Bachman and Palmer's notion of the target language use, or TLU, context here. And the paper by LaFleur and Staples explicitly links TLU domain analysis to evaluating the extrapolation inference of a validity argument, drawing on the validation model of Kane. Can you explain how we use this kind of corpus and the advantages it offers us in the practice of validation?
Sure. Actually, real-world corpora have become really indispensable in language testing, and it's hard to imagine that a reputable testing company would develop a test of any specific purpose without consulting a corpus of real live language in that situation. It's important, first of all, for sampling the domain adequately in test development. For example, if you want to claim that your tests academic language, you need to think about all the situations that students encounter in their academic lives. It's not just listening to lectures and reading textbooks, but talking to a professor in office hours, participating in study groups, and sending emails. A well-designed corpus can help test writers make sure that they're writing items that represent all of these different communicative events and language varieties that would be important in that setting. And another really important way in which real-world corpora are helpful in testing is investigating the correspondence between how people respond to test tasks and how they use language in the target language domain. So, for example, a typical test might include a 30-minute argumentative essay. So we want to know, well, how does performance on that test correspond to the ability to write a history paper or a lab report? In what ways is the writing produced under these conditions similar or different? So in order to do that, a corpus is very helpful in making those claims.
One of the things I really like about this special issue of language testing is the way in which it puts language back centre stage in language testing. And far too often we talk about the testing and the language is almost incidental. Yet Egbert points out that corpus studies are being used to inform the automated scoring of writing and potentially speaking. But one of my worries is that we may be in danger of creating new artificial standards, a bit like the old myth of the educated native speaker, against which real individuals are measured. Is this something that concerns you?
Well, I certainly understand your concern, and there has been a lot written about automated scoring, both pro and con, recently. The main objection to automated scoring is that the algorithms can only measure surface features like syntax and vocabulary or errors, and not content or communicative effectiveness. Of course, that's a valid objection. We may someday teach a computer to read for meaning, but we certainly aren't there yet. It's important to remember, though, that there are a couple of factors that make automated scoring virtually inevitable, particularly for high-volume, large-scale testing. And that is, first of all, human raters are not always reliable. And second, human raters are expensive. A good automated scoring engine can rate much more quickly than people can, and just as reliably. Plus, you don't have to feed them. So, I could say a lot more, but I'm just going to say for now that, in my opinion, automated scoring can be a good complement to human scoring as long as it doesn't replace it completely. I think it's important to always have a human score for a language test. But I think it's important to remember that the alternative to automated scoring, just given the expense of rating, speaking, and writing, is getting rid of extended writing and speaking tests altogether because they're simply too expensive to score. We're already seeing that in some of the newer tests coming on the market. And we have to remember that large-scale tests have added speaking and writing over the last 15 years because that's what teachers want, that's what test scorers want, and that's authentic language use. So I think there's a place for automated scoring.
I'm sure there's a lot of discussion to be had around this. Automated scoring appears to be one of those issues in assessment that makes people's blood boil, whichever side of the argument they're on. But let's round off this issue of the podcast by asking you to do the crystal ball gazing stuff. Very briefly, where will we be in another 5 years? What are the promises of corpus linguistics, and what do we expect next?
Well, I'm not a fortune teller, but I think I can take a couple of educated guesses. First of all, in terms of new corpora, I think we'll see a lot of advances in speech-to-text conversion, which will help with developing new corpora of spoken language. Also, multimodal corpora that might include visual information such as gestures. We can see corpora for less commonly taught languages or different language varieties. So I definitely think there's going to be a lot more in terms of the development of corpora. And then analytic tools, as I mentioned earlier, we can't really analyze content in writing or speaking as well as we can linguistic structure. It would be nice to see, tools that could get at things like pragmatics in speaking or audience and awareness and voice in writing. And then what I'd really like to see is some applications of corpus linguistics for classroom assessment tools in addition to large-scale assessment. I'm not sure what that would look like, but there are some corpus-based feedback tools, automated feedback tools, and intelligent tutoring systems, but they're not really very nuanced at this point. So I'd love to see some of the ideas around dynamic assessment, assessment for learning, benefit from these new corpus tools to really support student learning.
Sarah, this has been a really interesting discussion around the issues raised by these terrific papers in this special edition of the journal. I'm sure that it will be hugely informative for our listeners, and especially for all those potential students of language testing out there who may be thinking about using corpora in their own assessment research. Thank you for taking time out to talk to us.
Thanks, Glenn. I really enjoyed speaking with you too, and I hope your listeners will feel free to reach out to me with their comments on the special issue or this podcast.
Thank you for listening to this issue of Language Testing Bites. Language Testing Bites is a production of the journal Language Testing from Sage Publications. You can subscribe to Language Testing Bites through iTunes, or you can download future issues from ltj.sagepub.com or from languagetesting.info. So until next time, we hope you have enjoyed the current issue of Language Testing Bites.